Thank you for attending at Sigma Iota Rho's event, Energy Security Trends. My name is Megan Shipman, and I am the Vice President of Sigma Iota Rho. I would like to start by thanking the Elliott School of International Affairs for letting us host this event. I would also like to thank our panelists for taking time out of their evening to speak to our organization and GWU students very much. I would also like to invite any and all Elliott students interested in learning more about Sigma Iota Rho to talk to any of the current members in the room after the event. There are also informational pamphlets at the back entrance of the room and other information about SIR. As an honor society of international affairs, Sigma Iota Rho strives to engage our members and the GW community in conversations about relevant world issues. From lighting our homes, to fueling our cars, to running businesses, and anything from factories to manufacturing. Energy plays a pervasive role in our lives. And through discussions like this one, our organization hopes to grow our ability to analyze issues about energy policy with more confidence and understanding. Without any further ado, I would like to present our panelists. Dr. Robert Ortung is an Assistant Director of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, and an Associate Professor of International Affairs at the George Washington University's Elliott School. He has co-edited and written a number of books. He is the Managing Editor of the Journal of Post-Soviet Democratization and co-editor of the Russian Analytical Digest. Dr. Stephen Daichi has been a professorial lecturer at the Elliott School of International Affairs. One of the courses he teaches is actually on global energy security. Prior to coming to GW, Daichi was a Foreign Service officer serving in South Asia, Europe, and Latin America, having taught international affairs in over 80 countries around the world. For the 16 years prior to coming to GW, he was the chair of South Asia and Afghanistan Area Studies seminars at the Foreign Service Institute at the Department of State, teaching members of the State Department and members of the U.S. intelligence community. He has also presented yearly seminars at the headquarters of the U.S. Forces Pacific Command, and his two most senior assignments in the Foreign Service were as Consul General of the United States in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and Minister Counselor of the United States Embassy in New Delhi, India. And at this point, I would like to start off by letting Dr. Daichi have the floor and give him about 15 to 20 minutes and talk to you guys about his experiences. Dr. Daichi.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. This is the best dressed group of students I've run into here at GW, so I'm very proud of that. And there's at least 3 students of mine here, so I hope I'm not going to disappoint them. Now, you have to pick one subject to talk about that has international implications and has something to do with energy. So what I would like to talk about is a Keystone XL pipeline. Now you heard a lot about that, and obviously that is a very complicated and controversial domestic political issue. But it also has important international implications. Now that there's been a change in makeup of Congress, it's quite possible that maybe finally, after years of twiddling their thumbs, they've finally got to find a way to make a decision on it, which hopefully I hope will be in favor of it, although I know that there are a lot of people who place greater importance on the environment than on making sure that they have cars that they can drive for the next 20 years. We're against it. And here's the deal. This is basically an issue. Domestically, it's a very important issue. The reason the president hasn't approved it is, frankly, we have a very powerful environmentalist lobby here, which is one of the important components of the Democratic Party's support base. And as rigid and inflexible as they are, I have to say that what they're concerned about has a lot of merit. It's especially visible when you talk about fracking, which is even more controversial. But if you're talking, for example, about contaminating the water supply, every human being, regardless of age, background, experience, is opposed to that. So there's nothing unconscionable about being in favor of that. Everybody's in favor of that. But if you take a look at energy issues, whether it's oil and petroleum, whether it's natural gas, whether it's nuclear power, or anything else, they all have their pluses and minuses. They're all complicated. They're all very controversial. They all have, and coal, not to mention coal, which is demonized to an extraordinary degree because of the carbon dioxide emissions issue, which even with all of our scientific prowess, we haven't been able to really manage removing carbon dioxide from burning coal. That's unfortunate. But somebody asked, sometimes I get a little impatient, but somebody asked me once, well, what about alternate sources of energy? That's what we believe in: solar power, wind power, hydroelectric power. And usually my smart answer for that is, well, there are about 150 million private vehicles in the United States today, and another 150 million trucks that run on diesel or one thing or another. And when the day comes when those 3 million vehicles run on solar power, we will have made the transition to alternate sources of energy. I don't expect it to be around at that time. I'm hoping to make it tonight. That's why I'm going to keep my remarks home to my wife at the time the examining happens. Now, the Keystone XL pipeline has to do with the fact that Alberta, which is the far western province of Canada, has discovered a new way to get oil, and that is similar to strip mining. It's closer to the surface. You have to dig the wells deeper. And the process of getting oil out of that is a whole different technology that they've had to work out in the last 10 years. And like all new technologies, they have serious flaws until people work them out gradually and hopefully. But they do emit quite a bit of carbon dioxide. Now, people in this country are opposed to it for two reasons. One of them is that, why are we facilitating Canada's opportunity to market its contaminating shale oil? Now, the carbon dioxide is emitted one way or another. Whoever buys that stuff, it's not going to be a lot in the United States in any case. We buy a tremendous amount of regular oil from Canada. They're one of our best friends. They now have a new source of energy for which there's a great deal of demand. You don't sell oil to customers. Normally you sell it to refineries, which are separate businesses, and it's the refineries which then can turn around and sell to anybody they wish, including sell it back to Canadian companies. The thing isn't worth anything commercially after it's refined. The carbon dioxide is going to be emitted. Now, if you think that by selling it to the Chinese, they're going to emit all the carbon dioxide, you'll be amazed. Carbon dioxide up in the air, there are no boundaries and border crossing points and customs agents up there. If indeed it's a serious contaminant in the atmosphere for global warming, it doesn't matter where you burn it, it does the same thing. Now, the other thing that people are interested in is the contamination of water, and there is a special situation with the Keystone XL pipeline. When it goes through the Nebraska, there's something called the Ogallala Aquifer. Aquifer is underground deposits of water. This is one of the biggest ones in the world, and 6 states get their drinking water from that aquifer. So this is of extraordinary importance. That pipeline is going to have to go through, at least, at best, through the margins, if not through the middle of that aquifer. If that isn't built right, and if it leaks and poisons the water supply for a large group of people, that's really serious. Now, TransCanada, the company that has done this, has gone to extraordinary lengths of research, which they've let everybody in the world look at it. And they have a system of pipelines which have chemical observation centers, whatever, detection centers, at amazingly short distances from each other, all of them connected with the headquarters, so that if the slightest leak occurs, the central office immediately notified and they can shut it off. And most scientists agree that that's as safe as you can get today. Now, no matter how safe you get, the mistakes can occur. You look at the McConville well, that was a tragedy, 1,000 people got killed. Since then, 15 times more deeper offshore wells have been dug in the middle of the ocean, and the companies have learned enough from the mistakes that were made that caused this tragedy, which was wide-ranging. It hasn't happened again. When you're doing research in these high-tech things, problems are going to occur. So it's not that it's an illegitimate issue. There's another issue. We have a law that says that if you're going to bring up something like this from another nation, and the State Department has to certify that it's not a danger to Americans. It's something that would take all of us in this room about 2 weeks to work out. It takes them 12 years to work out. They're not known for speed, nor are they known to be impervious to what the President wants their conclusion to be. So anyway, we've been diddling around this inexcusably for years. Now, Canada is one of our best friends. We don't have many left in this world. And they sell us a lot of their regular oil, which we badly need. And they want this pipeline to get their oil to our refineries. And most of our refineries are along the coast, because it's the refineries that sell the oil, because they break the petroleum down into aircraft fuel and diesel oil and gasoline and heating oil and shipping oil and all the rest of it. So you've got to get it to a refinery. Refineries are usually placed along the coast of the country, because once you're refined product, you want to load it on a ship and send it. And now, even natural gas, which is less contaminating than oil is normally in petroleum, has to, as a gas, you can only go through pipelines. So if you want to send your natural gas to Europe, you have to liquefy it. So LNG, liquefied natural gas, is a very expensive, high-tech process. And that's done at certain companies along the coast, most prominent one being the first one that undertook it, Cheniere Energy, which I was stupid enough not to buy stock in when they first went into business. That's not necessarily in conflict with my normal personality, but in any case. So there's tremendous demand for this. There would be benefits to the American economy, including jobs which environmentalists deprecate, including greater income. We've become a major energy power in the world in the last few years through fracking, which is obviously more controversial than the pipeline. And just one word about that. North Dakota, they have 10,000 wells fracking now. thousands of people have gone there to work. And the only time I've ever given a talk on fracking, decided never to do it again, was in the early days. And they literally tore me apart. How dare I defend something that is so poisonous to the population? Now, North Dakota, they've been doing it for 10 years. They got tens of thousands of people there. We haven't heard one story about the poisoning from the water supply. Now, if there are 50,000 people there working in this and not one of them has had a problem with the poisoned water supply in all these years, it obviously would have made the press. They're just waiting for it to happen. That means that bigger companies are taking over, more technology is becoming available. And so with technology you can solve things, but it takes longer than people have the patience to wait. So now that the Congress has switched the Republican Party, the chances are that Keystone Pipeline will finally be approved. The State Department approved it long ago. And then they came up, they invented another study they wanted them to do for a year to double check it. So this is one of the most important energy issues we have in this country. And now the Congress is likely to approve it, not so much to spite President Obama, even though some people wouldn't mind doing that, myself included, but it's because a senator from Louisiana, who's a Democrat, is involved in a runoff, and she has been a steady supporter of this pipeline, and she now has to win this runoff. They figure that maybe if she can finally get this through, she'll get re-elected, which I believe she deserves to do quite independently of this one issue, but she's always been a thoughtful, independent voice in the energy field. So here we have, if we don't let Canada sell this through the Keystone Pipeline, we're stabbing in the back one of our best reliable friends, who's our next door neighbor. Terrorists use that country as a way to get into our country. Inevitable, since you have a long border. We have a lot of things in common. So technology, energy, and politics and international affairs are all interwoven. And that's what I try to teach my students, is how all of these things relate together. And I've got 3 of my most brilliant students in this group, all of whom I'm very proud. And they've heard me carry on like this before, so they're not surprised. So that's what I brought up.
Okay.
Now I'm turning my colleague who has got impressive qualifications beyond what I've done.
Thank you very much. So what I thought I'd do is something a little different. I wanted to give you a big picture overview of Russia, the United States, and their energy relationship and interrelationship, and sort of do a little bit of a compare and contrast in terms of the two, because the two countries are actually very important in the energy sphere, because they're both the biggest producers and consumers of energy in the world. And where they're different, though, is that obviously Russia is a big exporter of energy, both oil and natural gas, whereas the U.S., up until recently, is a big importer of oil and natural gas. And talking about fracking, the U.S. is now the biggest producer of natural gas in the world. It overtook Russia, which had been the biggest producer. And according to the International Energy Agency, which just put out its annual report today, the growth in our shale gas production is going to keep going until the 2030s. So regardless of what people think about the environmental consequences, it's expected to keep on going no matter what. So as you know, since Russia is an energy exporter, U.S. is an energy importer, they both look at the world in different ways. And so for the U.S., the main concern internationally is, of course, security of supply. And so we're constantly worried about what's going on in the Middle East, Venezuela, North Africa, Canada, one of our main energy providers, and Mexico. Obviously, since our energy production has been going up quite rapidly in the last few years, this has become less and less of a concern. Now you see gasoline, for less than $3 a gallon, so that's a big difference. Russia, on the other hand, is not so much concerned about security of supply, but security of demand. They want to make sure that they have a market where they can sell their product. And right now, the EU is the main customer for oil and natural gas. But the big problem for Russia is, beyond the sanctions as a result of the war in Ukraine, demand for energy is going down in the EU, and it's expected to go down, for the long-term future. They're just becoming much more energy efficient. They don't need as much energy as it did in the past. So Russia is desperately looking for other markets where it can sell its energy. And before fracking began here 5-10 years ago, they thought that the U.S. was going to be a big market for their natural gas. So they were planning to sell their energy here. But that hasn't happened. And so they've had to look for other sources. And at the moment, as the European market shrinks, they're looking more and more to China. And so that's going to really cause a lot of problems for Russia, because they'll become more and more dependent on China and on the success of China. And that's causing a lot of concern among Russian planners. That giving up their Western markets for China makes them feel a little bit insecure, because China is a big, powerful, growing economy right on their southern border. So that's causing a lot of concern. So then I wanted to, that's a quick, brief overview, but I wanted to look at the question of, do countries use energy as a weapon, which is often a big topic that people like to look at in international politics. And so here again, you have two different perspectives, from the exporter side and from the importer side. And so for the exporters, Russia, when it thinks about its energy, it's always wondering whether it should use it as a way of building up alliances and friendships with other countries around its borders, or it should just use its energy to make as much money as possible. So that's always a dilemma. And if you look at the Russian energy sales, particularly their natural gas sales, they have different prices for different countries. So if your country is friendly to Russia, you tend to get a pretty good discount on your natural gas prices. And if your country is not so friendly to Russia, it tends to cost a lot more. So Ukraine, for example, is paying something on the order of $300 to $400 per cubic meter of gas, whereas countries like Armenia, which are friendly, or Belarus, might pay $165. So it's a pretty big difference in the prices. And the U.S., on the other hand, also, even though we're an energy importer, we also use energy as a weapon, and we probably use energy as a weapon much more than the exporting countries. And the main way that we use energy as a weapon is through blocking access to our markets. So in particular, the most effective way that we've used energy as a weapon is against Iran. So Iran, there's huge international sanctions on Iran. They can't sell their oil and natural gas on the international markets. That's really causing problems for their economy, and perhaps forcing them to give up their nuclear program, although they're supposed to make a decision in the next couple of weeks, and we'll see what happens. And it'd be very interesting to see if they actually do give up the nuclear program. It seems very unlikely that they will, but in any case, it's clear that the sanctions, the energy sanctions that the Western countries have put on them are clearly having a powerful impact on their economy. And then, just briefly to look at questions of the environment, we brought it up a little bit with the Keystone Pipeline. If you look at environmental issues in the case of Russia, it's very interesting, because they always use the environment for their specific political purposes. And there's very little concern about actually protecting the environment. But it's not unusual for the Russian government to talk about its desire to protect the environment. And so, for example, in one case, you saw Shell Oil was doing a lot of production on the far east of Russia, on the Pacific coast, and making a lot of money. And so the Russian government decided that it wanted to have a big piece of that money. So they started complaining about the environmental consequences of what Shell was doing. And so then Shell cut them in for a bigger piece of the profit, and they stopped complaining about the environment. So it was a very quick solution. And so even though the environmental issues are still the same, nobody complains about them because they're getting their piece of the pie. And by the same token, obviously fracking in the United States is hurting Putin's ability to sell natural gas to European countries and to the United States itself. And so he's been complaining a lot about the environmental consequences of fracking. But obviously he doesn't really care if the United States is doing something environmentally dangerous to its own country or not. But certainly it looks good for him to bring up this issue of fracking as an environmental concern, because that would certainly help the Russian side. On the US side, obviously people raise environmental concerns, but it hasn't seemed to slow down energy production in this country, which is actually increasing lately. And so if you look at what Americans think about energy and the environment, they basically have two goals when they buy energy. They want it cheap, is the main goal, and they want it clean. So, but cheap is by far the most important goal. Cheaper the better. So, but then if you start doing polls, and there's a new book out called Cheap and Clean, which looks at the way Americans relate to energy issues. What's interesting in their environmental concerns is that they are concerned about local issues. So like, for example, I grew up in Southern California 25 years ago. It was very smoggy all the time, and we couldn't go to school some days because it was too smoggy to go outside. So we had to stay home and sit near the air conditioner, hopefully that it was filtering out all the smog that was outside. So people get concerned about those kind of issues, very local, they can see it, they can smell it, and so then they're going to be active trying to oppose it, whereas they're much less concerned about broader global issues like global warming. And then just a concluding thought on the relationship between energy and war, which is also a good topic for IR students. And this, it's clear that some people have done a lot of thinking about this topic, and it's an increasingly important topic that's getting more and more researched in the future, and in particular because it's very controversial, because on one hand energy sort of seems to promote war, and on the other hand it seems to prevent war and promote cooperation. So in the sense that it promotes war, it's the sort of resource wars that Michael Clare and a lot of other people have been writing about. And the basic idea is that there's more and more people on the planet, and they're getting to a higher standard of living, particularly in places like China, you know, where people are buying cars and bigger houses and refrigerators and all kinds of things that consume energy. So there's going to be more and more demand for fewer and fewer resources, and that's inevitably going to lead to war. So there's a lot of people who write these kind of alarmist books that look at that. On the other hand, though, there's a lot of reasons you can think that energy will give you incentives to work together peacefully. And if you look at, for example, the Persian Gulf, Russia, Norway, there's a lot of places where energy is right on the border between lots of different countries. And in order to get the money that you get from developing those energy resources, those countries have to work together. Because to produce energy, you need to make a lot of investment in the oil wells, the natural gas wells, and then the production and transportation links to bring all that energy to market. So in order to do that, to get the money from that, you have to have a lot of political stability in the area. So in that sense, the financial gains produced from energy actually give countries an incentive to be peaceful. So I think I'll end my remarks on that happy comment, and I think we're both ready to answer any questions or engage in discussion with you all.
Just a quick round of applause. I'm just going to take this next session to have you guys ask some brilliant questions for our guys here, and for the next 15-20 minutes or so, keep it within the time frame. Would anyone like to start with a question? Amaris?
Hi, so thank you
State your name first.
Okay,
gotcha.
So first I wanted to say thank you for coming out and speaking with us. My name is Amaris Trazo. I'm a sophomore with SIR. And my question is actually for Dr. Arjun, is that his name? You mentioned the Iranian sanctions and the fact that those talks are coming up very soon. I was wondering if maybe you could predict how you think those might go, and analyzing specifically the effectiveness of the sanctions, because you mentioned that they have impacted the economy. but do you think they've impacted enough to produce the results that the U.S. wanted?
No, that's a very good question, and I wish I knew the answer. But all right, so the prediction would be that the talks are going to end without any kind of real solution to the problem. That the Iranians are going to want to keep their nuclear weapons, their nuclear weapon program presumably going, and the West is going to want them to stop, and they're not going to be able to resolve that issue. And I think that the sanctions have been very effective in really destroying the Iranian economy and making it difficult for them. But most of these sanctions are never, these economic sanctions never are able to produce the political result that the country imposing them wants. And so we see with Iran, they're under pressure, but they're still not giving in. Same with Ukraine, we put a lot of economic sanctions on Russia, but that doesn't really affect Russia's behavior. So same with Cuba, obviously we've had sanctions on Cuba for the last 30, 40 years, but no change in their behavior whatsoever. So most of the time I don't think that these sanctions work, although they do cause a lot of pain for the country on the other side. So unfortunately, so I doubt that they're going to be able to come to an agreement. However, if you look at U.S.-Iranian relations in a broader context of the Middle East, I think it probably makes more sense for the United States to have a good relationship with Iran than some of the other countries in the region, because I think there's much better civilizational links between the two. So I think on the specific issue, it's going to be hard to move forward. But I think that specifically within the Obama administration, there's a strong interest in promoting better relations with Iran. So I think that that's a possibility. You might have comments on that too.
Well, everything you've said I agree with. Probably don't feel that way about what I said, but anyway, that's okay. But I'll say this, there is no precedent for a country that has made a major investment to master the nuclear cycle that has given up that right. They don't think that the non-proliferation treaty expects them to give up the right. They claim they don't want to use it for military purposes. We don't trust them. But the fact is that when you master a nuclear cycle, like India has proved now for 45 years, they will not give up that right. Now, the leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, is a strange guy. He's an old, very rigid, tough kind of guy. But in the last few days, he made a statement saying that yes, these sanctions are having an economic effect, but his feeling is, as strange as it may seem, that he'd rather see Iran impoverished than give up a fundamental right the world is demanding that they're entitled to have. So he's willing to live with us. Now, whether the majority of the Iranians are going to be willing to live with that, but that remains to be seen.
Hi, good evening. My name is Shelton. I'm a senior concentrating in international politics. And I'd like to ask, with the developments in technology that allow energy to turn into nuclear proliferation, do you see nuclear technology becoming a primary issue in the future as technologies continue to advance, especially becoming more accessible to developing countries in the future?
Well, the trouble with technology, and this is a real problem, is that technology is very expensive. And so for developing countries to get it, unfair as it may be, it's a huge problem. I'll just give you one example. That's in drugs. I served a lot of years in India. If you're taking a statin to lower cholesterol, a pharmaceutical company had to invest $250 million at least to do the research and try 15 different drugs before they found one that works. They marketed it, and the cost for them to enable them to do that again is to charge $1 about 10 per pill. Now, Indians can't afford that. And Indians say, well, we'll do whatever we have that we can do by playing with the law to make it accessible to our people. But if you look at it realistically, and they do, and the companies that have the patents object to it, but the fact is the technology is expensive, and it requires large investment, and if you can't get a return on that investment by getting paid for it so that you can then invest that money and do new research, then it ain't gonna work. Is that fair to developing countries? Well, in many ways it isn't. But it's a fact of life, unfortunately.
Just a quick answer to that question. I mean, in the case of Russia and Iran, for example, Russia said it's going to build 6 new civilian nuclear energy plants in Iran in the next several years. So that's sort of from the Russian point of view, that's the solution to Iran's desire to build nuclear weapons, which is to give them much more civilian nuclear technology to build nuclear energy plants. So from the Russian perspective, that's not going to lead to them producing nuclear weapons. From the U.S. perspective, that's very dangerous because it looks like it would lead to weapons production. It's not clear. But if you look at the International Energy Agency, the report that came out today, it said by 2040 we're going to increase nuclear power by 60% in the world. So they anticipate that nuclear power will be about near 25% of world production of energy by 2040. So it's a pretty big increase, despite all the problems you had in Japan and concerns about nuclear proliferation.
Again, I agree with what you said. I'd just like to add that the United States would give a shirt of its back if they could build 6 nuclear plants in India, right? Because we trust the Indians, we don't trust the Iranians. These are feelings that shouldn't be part of diplomatic practice. Diplomatic practice, trust is a factor, but I mean the reality is that there's a doctrine called mutual assured destruction. If you use a nuclear weapon against a country, it will be used against you. You have to have a political leader who's suicidal and is willing to commit suicide on behalf of this country to do things that will lead to that country being nuked. And therefore, as stiff and hard and stubborn and Khamenei is, there's no evidence that he is suicidal. Unfortunately, people who commit suicide, there's nobody ever will predict who it's going to be. But it's usually not heads of nations because they care enough about their nation. They're not going to do it. So I don't think there's going to be an agreement because they think that they have as much right to manage the nuclear cycle as the Western countries who did it first. But is this going to lead to all the consequences that some smaller countries in the region are predicting, even though they've had a nuclear program long before any Middle Eastern countries had it? They never mentioned that. But it's not going to enter into the picture.
I'm Lauren, I'm a senior in SIR. I want to thank both of you again for coming and speaking to us tonight. And I was wondering, over the years since the beginning of your careers, where do you see the most progress in terms of energy and being clean and efficient, whether it's in natural gas, for example, nuclear, solar, hydropower, if there's any specific field where you see the most progress and promise?
Well, I mean, since I mentioned I was from Southern California, when I was growing up, the city where I grew up, Riverside, which is 60 miles east of Los Angeles, and is famous because all the smog from Los Angeles blows from the winds to Riverside, where there's a big mountain, so it all gets stuck in Riverside. It was one of the smoggiest places in the country. But in the last 25 years, that problem has more or less gone away because the quality of gasoline that the cars are burning now is much cleaner. So even though obviously we burn as much gasoline as we did in the past, or even more, the technology and all these different things have improved. So you see big changes there. I think in terms of efficiency of electronic appliances, California has also been a leader in doing that, so that sort of thing. I think the thing that we didn't expect to see was much more energy production in the United States. There's all this peak oil literature, which said that U.S. energy production, oil production in particular, peaked in the 1970s, and it was going to be going down ever since. Well, now it's all going up. And so there's it's like being a member of the Flat Earth Society. These guys were saying that it's over. That's it for energy production in the United States. And then there's the technology and production has dramatically changed in the last 25 years. And that's actually in the last 5 or 10 years it's really come online. So I think those would be the biggest things that I would see. And I assume, looking forward, I'm pretty optimistic. I think that perhaps even you will live to see all these solar-powered cars around. I think that that's a real American solution to all these problems is technology. So I think that Silicon Valley will be able to come up with some of the stuff. You already see electronic cars, sitting in the parking lots, plugged in. Like at the airport, they're all plugged in. All those volts are plugged in, and as you go out of the garages and stuff like that. So I think that these things that we never imagined, and all these little tiny Euro cars that are driving around. We see a lot of them at GWU that can sort of park between all the other cars. That's something I never thought we'd saw here. So I think these kind of technologies are coming in. And half the people in the Elliott School ride their bikes to work. So like, people who are 20-something. So that's a whole new thing too. So I think we'll see sort of a return to the bicycle culture.
Well, there's just been a big advance in the field of electrical cars. One of the biggest problems with them has been that they have to have lithium batteries, which have turned out to be quite expensive, big, and subject to fires, and yet they've discovered technologies very recently that will allow using smaller lithium batteries that are safer. That'll make a huge difference in the electric cars. I think the volt was going to be the answer. Everybody knows is buying the damn car. But very shortly, a lot of the most important questions have been solved by technology in electric cars, just like the professor said. I agree with, have a promising future. The place that's been the biggest disappointment in alternate energy is always assumed that hydroelectric power is a great, safe way of producing electricity. Now, I'm one of the few people who teaches an extensive section in my course on water, and that's one of the reasons. Because when you look at what China has done with hydroelectric power, it has created a tremendous amount of pollution. It displaced large numbers of population. Has built a lot of dams which are clogged by siltation. They don't control floods the way they're supposed to. The Hoover Dam, when it was built, that's working well now, and that was a long time when it was built. But today, the downside of hydroelectric power, or at least building the dams, is not the most encouraging thing in promising that that's going to be a big source of alternate energy.
Hi, my name is Gabriel. I'm a junior at Elliott School, concentrating in security policy. I want to ask, part of the European Union's energy security policy over the last couple of years has been to start to rid itself of the dependence on imports from Russian natural gas, which is more covered around 33-35% of the total imported amount. And therefore, part of that strategy has been to develop an east-west corridor with the Levant Basin, Persian Gulf, and Caspian, which means that new players are coming in terms of the race to supply Europe with natural gas. And Russia's always had the relationship of being a gatekeeper for Europe in terms of both supplying gas, as the whole infrastructure of gas from the Caspian has always passed through Russia, so it's been able to control that. And with this development of the new east-west corridor, one of the very interesting players is Turkey, because it's pretty much the only country which connects these three main regions to Europe. So I want to ask you what your perspective is on the role which Turkey will take on as a gatekeeper, because essentially it's not so much a supplier of gas, but more a transient country. But essentially, it would be able to cut off all these potential regions from Europe. So, if you see any security implications, or generally the potential for Turkey there.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. I think Turkey would definitely like to be the gatekeeper for European energy, but I don't think that it actually will be. The first problem is, of course, lack of supply, because there's some energy would be coming from Azerbaijan, but there's not really that much in Azerbaijan that could be shipped across. And Turkmenistan, which is also a potential source of energy, has mostly been selling all of its energy to China. so that stuff is going east instead of west. So I think, though, that Europe definitely, since 2006, when Russia cut off the gas supplies to Ukraine the first time around, that was a wake-up call. And ever since then, they've been, the EU has been trying to find as many sources of alternative sources of energy as possible. And I think, shockingly, even though the EU is 28 countries and they don't seem to work together very well, you know, it's always one big mess. But they do seem to be actually making pretty good progress in this area, in the sense that they're developing, you know, alternative sources like solar and wind, and that's a little bit, but they're also getting liquefied natural gas, which can come from Australia, come from the Middle East, and even perhaps from the United States in the future. And then they're also building up their pipelines so that they can move the energy around in the different parts of the continent, because when you look at who's dependent, it's really the countries in the east that are 100% dependent on Russia, whereas the countries in the west have much greater supplies. So if they built pipelines from the western countries to the eastern countries inside the EU, they'd have a lot more capacity to withstand a Russian shutoff. So I think it's a slow process because you need to build all this infrastructure and develop this capacity, but they've been working on it pretty hard. It's sort of a quiet revolution going on in Europe, and I think at some point Russia's going to wake up and realize that the Europeans have found other sources of energy and they're not nearly dependent on them the way they used to be. But I think they'll always buy some energy. You know, it's better to be, say, 10% dependent on Russia than 30%. And so if they're just 10% dependent on Russia, Russia, of course, is dependent on the income from the EU. So I think the EU is increasingly, over time, getting into a much stronger bargaining position with Russia. So it's going to have different sources, it's going to need less energy going forward. And so I think Putin's power is probably at its peak now, and it's going to be declining over time. So, and I don't think Turkey will be a partial player there, but not a huge player.
Okay, one more question, and I did have you last time, so this is, we're gonna have to cut it off. But if you have questions, maybe you guys will stick around for like 5 minutes after this last question. Okay, but for everyone else, this will be the last question, so we can get on time.
Hi, my name is Roland, and I want to ask a question about Middle East. Since we're talking about energy security, and that's sort of the region that comes up to my mind when we talk about it. Two pieces of information that I have. One is a report by IEA was projecting that Basra has the 25% of the growth potential for the next couple decades, and with the situation in Iraq today, how is that going to change the world's energy dependence on the Middle East? And another thing is, just last month, Lockheed Martin just announced that they had a new breakthrough in fusion technology. Just with these two pieces of things, how does that, is the world going to be more dependent on Middle East energy, or is it going to be shifting away with all these new sources of shale oil and other things?
Let me tell you, the world has been getting along really well, relatively speaking, for a lot of years without depending on the oil that comes from Basra. And that ain't going to change. Nor is the amount of oil coming from Basra is going to change because they don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the engineers, they don't have anything. And as the situation in Iraq becomes more and more unstable, the Western majors which have the technology are withdrawing from southern Iraq because their executives are not willing to live there. It's too dangerous. Iraq does have the potential to be a major energy supplier, but they have yet to demonstrate that they're capable of taking advantage of it. They haven't done it in 40 years. And it looks like it's less likely now that they're going to do it than they've done it in the past. As far as that other question you're concerned, hey, there's technology, great stuff going on all over the world. I'm all for every bit of it. And whatever doesn't work this year will work 2 years from now, or 5 years from now. And that'll help a lot of people. Not everybody, but money and oil are the big thing. If you got those two things, you got no problems.
Well, it's
But
a
if you
good,
don't,
yeah, that's a good point on the fusion, because like you look at fracking, nobody expected the fracking technology to come along, and it sort of revolutionized everything about 5 years ago. So cold fusion, you know, it's impossible to predict if fusion is going to be a possibility. We had the cold fusion, which turned out to be nothing. This fusion might turn out to be something. It's impossible to predict, and so that's what makes it really interesting, is that in the energy field, things could change quite radically. So, you know, if you look at the standard agency reports, they're always predicting out, you know, a conservative trend line and a potential trend line, and you know, optimistic and a pessimistic. But then it's very hard to predict these very radical changes. So I told my kid, who's a freshman in college, that he should invent, you know, better batteries and wireless electricity and things like that. He said, "Okay, Dad, we'll see." I think there's a lot of potential there. So I mean, I think that's a very exciting field to be going into.
Okay. Well, let's thank Robert and Stephen again for tonight.